I have a lot of people who call me for marriage counseling, and so I want to give a few insights of what would actually happen if you came in for counseling, and maybe that will help you on your journey. The first thing I always go over is a couple of rules, and one is no secrets, and so it's really important that you don't keep secrets from each other. And I know that people have asked me at times if everybody needs to know everything, and I think that there's some truth to the fact that people have secrets that they've maybe never told anybody ever. And oftentimes the situation occurs where someone says, well, do you think it's wise to tell people things that might actually hurt them more? And I think that's something that you really need to pray about, that it really needs to be a very, very strong decision that you need to use with a lot of wisdom, and I think that you need to ask God for wisdom in that regard. But for the most part, most secrets that people keep are usually things that their spouse really needs to know. And I think that as a rule, I tell people you can't call me in between sessions and tell me secrets that the other person doesn't know, or I will help you tell them, because it just creates more of a issue. The other thing I tell people too is to not interrupt. And that's really hard, especially when you're having difficulties. And so I often tell people, if you have a hard time with interrupting, get a pad and a pen when you're having a discussion about something and write notes. And at the end of every discussion in between people, you need to have a 3-second rule, which is waiting 3 seconds after the person's done talking before you respond to what they have to say. Often this gives you enough time to decide how you want to respond and to not respond too emotionally, but it also gives the other person enough time to complete their thought. And sometimes they will actually answer your question by the time they've completed their thought. The next thing I typically go to is the book of Ephesians in the Bible, and chapter 5. And that is the chapter where it talks about husbands loving your wives and wives submitting to your husbands. And often we mostly hear about wives submitting to our husbands. However, I typically read the verse before, and I'm going to read it, and this is out of the Message, but I'm going to read verse 21. So the segment about relationships and marriage is actually verse 22, but verse 21 says, out of respect for Christ, be courteously reverent to one another. Now that's a general statement for all Christians. Out of respect for Christ, be courteously reverent to one another. And so I typically ask couples, are you doing that? Are you in general doing that as a Christian? And you have to hold yourself accountable to that. Can you say that you are actually reverently respecting the other person out of reverence for Christ? And only really you can answer that question truthfully. And then the segment about spouses is really important. It talks about submission from a wife, but also talks about how much a husband will love his wife as Christ did the church and died for the church. And there's actually more verses in that segment regarding husbands and how they should love their wives than there are about women having to submit to their husbands. And I tell people all the time, I said, if you are a man and you live for your wife and give your life for her as much as Christ loved the church, then she will submit to you all day long. I tell people all the time, a woman who finds a man like that would have no problem submitting. I think that it's a mutual thing. As the wife submits, then the husband can step up. Oftentimes, the husband doesn't feel respected enough to be able to step into that position, or he oversteps his bounds in his expectations of the wife. And so again, it's important that each person look at their role in that. And I read it out loud, and I have them listen. What is your role? When you read through this passage of Ephesians chapter 5, this is verse 22, and through the end of the chapter, are you doing your portion of that? Can you say, I am that person that's being described there in that passage? Because I tell people, if you can come into my office and you can say, yes, I am, I'm 100% being that person, and then I tell them, then you can point your finger at your spouse. Because often people will come into my office and they'll say, but my spouse, this, that, and the other thing. And they'll have a long laundry list that if they would just do those things, I would be happier. However, when I ask them their role, they have a hard time answering that question. Are they being that person? And so if you can say, yes, I'm being that person, then you can come in and complain about your spouse. However, the reality is that if you actually get to that place where you're actually being that loving and that reverent to the other person, you're not going to want to point the finger at your spouse. You're actually going to want to be a helpmate and come alongside them and encourage them and be their partner and be the biggest cheerleader in life and help them along their path of life towards God. I think that when we look at our own healing and our own journey, then we can have compassion on our partner. I think it's really important for people to understand that when they come in for counseling in my office, I have to clarify that, it's really a dual journey. And I ask each person, how are they doing on their journey of life? Are they healing their past so that they can reach the person that God intended them to be, so that they can realize that and see themselves the way God sees them? And so it becomes a matter of two people going through counseling at the same time, helping each other. And I think that being able to come in as a couple helps me to understand where the hang-ups are, where the problems arise, and then where they came from. And most often they come from poor models of parenting or poor models of marriage in childhood. And I think most people say, well, you know, it shouldn't matter, I should be over that, I don't want to talk about my childhood, I don't want to talk about my past, but we have to realize that the models that we had as children are typically what we grow up to emulating and replicating. And we often will say, I don't want to grow up and be like this parent or that parent, and I'm not going to be like that kind of spouse. However, we don't know what we want to be like. Often I tell children and youth that they need to think about who they want to become. What does that look like? What kind of parent do you want to be? What kind of spouse do you want to be? And use a model. Have a model of that. Think of somebody who you know is actually a good parent or a good spouse. And then be like that parent. Because we can say we don't want to be like a lot of things, but when push comes to shove, we end up behaving in whatever was modeled to us, because that's our go-to. We have nothing else to pull from unless we consciously, purposefully look for a model to follow after. Often, as we look into childhood issues, we really need to be aware of how much our childhood has impacted us and how much our relationships with our parents impact the way we treat other people. Often when there's severe problems, we find the person that we're having issues with a safe person. They're not going anywhere, and so we treat them poorly because we know that they love us and they're going to come back. And most people will tell you they treat their family members worse than anybody else, and yet those are the people who we should love the most. I think that we have to be able to be at the place where we hold ourselves accountable, that we have an accountability partner of some sort, to be able to look at how we are behaving, and someone who can listen to you. You can go to them and say, you know, when it comes to this area of my relationship, I'm not doing so well. Yeah, how can you help me? What can I do? What are some things that I can do? And I'll tell you, the most important thing is to listen better, to respond less, and to really try to remove emotion from the heavy conversations. Can you have a conversation without emotion? And a lot of couples can't do that. They don't know how to put the facts on the table, discuss the actual problem, and identify the problem, and then resolve the problem. There's a lot of my way, your way, or you always, and I try to tell people, please don't use always or never, because those words are rarely truthful. It might feel that way, but they're rarely truthful. And I think it's important that you look at also your responsibilities. So a lot of times I'll have couples look and say, what are you willing to do? I make them write down 3 things. What are you willing to do to make the relationship better? And 3 very specific things. And then I write them on a little 3x5 card and send them home with that, and then ask them to bring it back, and then we go over it and say, well, how did you do in this area? And how did you do in this area? And really, it allows their partner to hear, I really was trying. I tried here, here, and here. I didn't make it here. I tried this one, it did work. I tried this one, it didn't work. And then we can adapt it and find out, well, how can we make you more successful in the goals that you have for how to improve your relationship. And so I try to be as practical as possible, to look at the things that are able to change. A lot of the times it's an emotional reaction to things that people really need to work on. Can I learn how to have a nice factual conversation about something that's really painful or really hurting me without wiping my feelings off on the other person? It takes a lot of will, it takes a lot of courage to be able to really step back and say, okay, I'm going to just really be honest about how that feels without being emotionally attacking the other person. And often I will tell the couples that somebody needs to be able to say, okay, I'm done. I'm done with the way we're doing it, because the way you're doing it isn't working. Are you going to be calling me? So if you're deciding that you're done, to try something different. And this is weird because it's different. It's very different. It's going to be different than whatever you've done before. And to be able to say, okay, I'm going to have the courage to do that. I'm going to have the courage to say, I'm going to completely do the way we communicate differently. I'm going to listen until you're done talking. I'm going to think about what you have to say. I'm going to try to identify the actual problem of what it is that you're talking about. And I'm going to come up with 2 to 3 different resolutions to that problem, so that I'm not just attacking you with my resolution and how come you're not doing it my way. And sometimes the resolutions that I might suggest might not be appropriate for the other person, but at least making an honest effort to really look at the actual problem. And one of the examples that I give is, if a woman is in the kitchen washing dishes and the water's running, and she turns the water off and she hears the shower running down the hallway, and she goes, oh, my husband should be home, must be home. And so she goes down around the kitchen, down through the living room, and she sees his shoes by the front door, socks in the hallway, pants by the bathroom door, shirt in the bathroom on the floor, and he's in the shower. And I say, so what's the problem? And typically the guys will say, I don't see a problem. The girls will say, he's disrespectful, he's a slob, or they'll say he didn't bother to come and say hi to me when he came home. And so women go to character assassination, and men don't even realize that there is a problem. And so the actual problem in this scenario is there are clothes on the floor. That's the actual problem. But people typically go to an emotional response, and so the clothes never actually get resolved. And so I tell people, come up with 3 to 4 different ways that we can resolve having clothes put on the floor. And so we can put the basket by the door, or we can put the basket by in the bathroom, the hamper, so that it's easier to get the clothes into the hamper. So there's a variety of ways to resolve things, and there's a lot of adaptability that needs to happen. I think the biggest problem for most people is really identifying what is the actual problem in this scenario. Can we say the actual problem and look at that problem and dissect it and say, okay, here's the reality of the problem. This is how I feel about this problem. This is the way it looks to me. And these are 3 ways that I think I can resolve it. And sometimes I'll have couples write down their ideas for resolution independently, and then come back together and compare their notes and see, is there anything that actually were similar or close, so that they can choose the one that actually seems to be the best for everybody involved. I think that the most difficult part is being able to look at your own responsibility in the relationship. How much are you donating to the problem? And can you admit to that and really look at that and say, okay, this area is where I'm failing and I need to try harder, and then go and really look at, why is that a problem for you? Where did that come from, and how are you trying to get that resolved? So I hope that this helps a little bit, that you have at least a step in the right direction of really looking at your relationship, and knowing that I believe that if you have 2 separate people who are really trying to reach God, that by the nature of the relationship, so if you have a man and a woman and God's up here, and they're both trying to reach God, that just by the nature of the relationship, they get closer together. So as you reach towards God, you will actually be getting close together. And I really hope that you will strive towards that, and that you will really strive to also have patience with your spouse as they journey on their path, because all of us come with some sort of baggage, and we have to learn how to accept those who have baggage as much as we have baggage, and help each other along our journey so that we can all someday reach heaven together.